Hi, I'm Chris Evans and I live at Applewood Permaculture Centre. Here we are in North Herefordshire, and we're going to talk about the principles of ecology. So looking at how natural systems work, and we're also going to talk about observation, the value of observation as a tool to understand about ecology, because one is understanding, but we also need a way of understanding how ecology works. So before we start to go into look at natural systems and the principles of ecology, a quick word about observation. So we've got our senses, we've got our eyes, our ears, our sense of smell and touch, and it's about using those to understand what's around us, to recognise patterns that are happening in nature. And we're always looking at things, we're always observing and seeing things in reality, but it's about being able to record that and hold those experiences and then be able to reflect on them and to understand what's going on. And it gives us a deeper connection to what we're looking at as well. And when we're trying to develop a deeper nature connection, then observing nature is obviously the way into doing that. So to use observation as a tool to develop a deep nature connection is what that's about. But if we're going to look at systems that are sustainable, this is what we need to learn from. And so my question to start with is, where has humanity, society, created a system that is truly sustainable, one that meets its own needs and is able to continue without degrading the resources it's based on? So that's a question, and I'm going to pause and leave you to reflect on that, and we'll come back. So I hope you've had a chance to contemplate that question. Where have humans made a truly sustainable system? My answer would be they haven't. They've come very close, and I think where they've come close is in indigenous cultures, traditional hunter-gatherers, forest dwellers that we see in South America, in Central Africa, in the Far East, Indonesia, the Philippines, and that are still existing, that is. Cultures of people that live in harmony with their environment, and they don't degrade the resources that they need that they depend on, whether that's water or soil or biodiversity, but they manage those resources without depleting them. However, even they haven't been truly sustainable, because they've been dissolved, they've been oppressed, they've been ripped apart and colonised by modern society, basically, whether you call that capitalism or neoliberal culture or whatever. So unfortunately that means that they've had an inherent unsustainability, a lack of resilience against that sort of pressure. It's not their fault. They actually have the principles of sustainability embedded in their culture. It's just that the new, let's say, neoliberal, capitalist or whatever culture has overtaken that and destroyed those cultures and that wisdom that they have, and that wisdom isn't counted as useful. So that's a key point, and it's why permaculture actually takes a lot of its knowledge and principles, design principles, from indigenous wisdom and indigenous culture. However, there isn't anywhere where we've done that, where we've been truly sustainable. And so how can we learn about it? Where do we go for our lessons, our examples, that we can say, this was sustainable, now we can replicate that and and continue and develop our sustainable culture. So we need to look at systems that are sustainable. And yes, one is those traditional cultures, indigenous wisdom. The other place to go and look is nature, because if we weren't around, nature would carry on. Nature and ecology is able to be sustainable. It's able to regenerate disturbed areas as well. And so if we want to learn how to be sustainable, that's where we need to go to look. We need to look at natural systems and learn what makes them sustainable. What are the principles of ecology that enable natural systems to function? And that's what these principles are about, and that's what we're going to have a look at. So when we're observing and talking about principles of ecology, there are many, there are several, and in terms of ordering them, I like to start at the beginning. And if we imagine before there were any trees, plants, animals around, for example, after the Ice Age, or if we go back even further, when the Earth was new, so maybe 1 billion years ago or more, and there was no plant life, there was no animals, therefore there was nothing happening. And how did life start? So how does life start? How does nature start to colonize a blank canvas is what we're looking at. And when it was just rock, the first things that happened was that from water came algae, and on the rock then we got plants starting to form that were a combination of algae plus lichen plus fungus. So there were three types of organism collaborating together in order to colonize the first surfaces outside of water. So this is the first connection between biological life and minerals that was happening. And so lichen are what you'd see first on a bare surface. And I say lichen, a combination of a plant and an algae, and with bacteria and fungi, all working together in the same organism, in the same lichen organism. So that's what we'd see first. If we went fast forward a bit, then what we'd see are grasses, mosses, and small plants. And a concept that it's good to introduce at this stage is the concept of an element that we're describing. So if you like, grass is an element, or the lichen is an element, and those elements have needs, and they have yields, and they have characteristics. So in terms of design, this is a key way of looking at things. And the needs of the first plants that will colonize an area are the same as for any plants. They actually need moisture, they need fertility, they need a growing place, they need sunlight. And in fact, one of the characteristics is that they have a lot of sunlight because it's bare, it's empty. If you look here, it's like an empty field, and so there's lots of light. And so with the characteristics of those sort of plants that come early in the colonization of a bare area is that they like lots of light. They exist really well in light. Another characteristic is that they don't need much nutrients. They need some, but not much, and often they don't need much water either, because there isn't much. If you imagine a bare area, the water, maybe it runs off or it's leached away quickly, nutrients likewise, and it's very exposed. So the characteristics of these plants are that they are able to exist in exposed, nutrient poor situations. And what they do is they colonize, they cover the soil. So that's what grasses and mosses are doing then, post-lichen stage, and they start to improve the site. They improve the amount of fertility because they're cycling nutrients, they're conserving water, and they start to create a better environment for other things to grow. So other things then come along that can exist in a better situation, and take the stage of recolonization further. So one of the elements that we see is, here's an example, and you might recognize it. It's a clover, and one of the characteristics of clover is that it fixes nitrogen. Although it's not clover that fixes nitrogen, it's in fact a bacteria that lives in the roots of the clover. So clover doesn't fix nitrogen, but a bacteria fixes nitrogen that grows symbiotically with the clover. So that fixes nitrogen, takes it out of the air where other plants aren't able to do that, and brings it into itself, and it releases that into the soil, either from the roots or when it dies, and that nitrogen then becomes available for other things to use it, whereas otherwise it wouldn't be around. And so the clover, or nitrogen fixing plants, plants that support nitrogen fixing bacteria, I should say, are very often found colonizing areas that are bare, that don't have forest cover on them. Here's another one. It's gorse. Gorse is another leguminous nitrogen fixing plant. So clover, gorse, vetch, there are many types of plant that will do that, but they have a particular role in this colonization. And the principle we're talking about here is called succession. So you've got a succession of life forms that go from lichens and things that start to cover minerals, start converting them into soil. In that soil then grows other things, and the process continues with more complex organisms, bigger organisms, plants starting to exist in that place. So here we've got bramble as well. We've got gorse, bramble, clover. They're three classic pioneers. You don't see them so much underneath a canopy of forest, but that is what succession is heading to. It's heading towards a forest, a high canopy, and a climax species of tree that will kind of dominate. Like in the UK, it's oak. In southern UK, it might be beech, but otherwise, that is then the climax cover. And we actually spend an awful lot of time and money trying to stop that process of succession. We try and keep fields down, as you see here, just to grass, and historically we've done that through fire management, so burning areas, more recently with livestock, grazing them, and through mowing, through ploughing, and using chemicals, herbicides. So as civilization has gone on, we've constantly been trying to struggle against this concept of succession, whereas nature will just take its course, and will move from a bare site, which it hates, into a site of forest, of climax canopy. So one thing about natural systems is that they're diverse. So diversity is a principle of ecology. There's lots of things. There's plants and lots of different types of plants. There's animals, there's insects, bacteria, birds, there's mammals. There are fungi, a kingdom of their own, the things that we don't see under the soil. There are a huge number of things here. So natural systems are diverse, and that diversity is part of their sustainability. And it's it's really about functional diversity. So we move from the principle of diversity to the principle of beneficial connections. So these are the functions of the system, that because there's so many things, there's so many different elements in the system, that there's connections, functional connections and beneficial connections between them. And that's another really important principle, is that the systems are made up of functional and beneficial connections. For example, you might hear a bird alarming, and that's alarming maybe because it's seen a fox, and that alarming is actually beneficial to all the other birds and a lot of the animals around, because it realizes that there's a predator in the area. Another way that beneficial connections happen is between the tree and the climber that's going up the tree. So the tree is helping to support the climber. Trees are also providing habitat and food for lots of other insects and fungi in the system. So there are all these interrelationships between different parts of the system, and they're beneficial. So it's about cooperation. And although we understand that competition happens, so plants are competing for light, for nutrients, for space, so competition does happen, but it's actually cooperation which is the driving force behind the sustainability and the resilience and the abundance of natural systems. So beneficial relationships between different elements in the system is a really important principle. So when we're talking about diversity, we've said that, in natural systems there's lots of diversity, there's lots of things. It's not just the sheer number of different things. It's that there are functional relationships between them. So this is the principle of beneficial relationships between parts of the system. So between the trees and the different species of trees and the fungus, for example, the mycorrhizae that's in the soil is perhaps one of the best examples of beneficial relationships between completely different species. One is a fungus, a mycorrhiza, and one is a tree. And we're just beginning to understand these relationships and how they work and how that both benefit. So we're talking about symbiotic relationships, cooperation rather than competition. So mycorrhizae in trees is an example. Different birds and other animals is another example. So if a predator comes, birds will call, they'll alarm, and so all the animals in the vicinity will become aware of that. So it's like, well, they're just doing it for themselves, but it's also benefiting everything else. And in this way, there are beneficial relationships between all the things here in some form or another. And that's one of the ways that these systems are so productive and resilient and low input, because everyone is helping each other. And what we know is that it's actually, yes, competition does occur. So trees are competing for light and they might be competing for nutrients, and that happens. But actually it's cooperation which is the main driving force behind the stability and productivity and the abundance of natural systems and their ability to exist even without people around. So relationships between the soil and the plants and the insects and the microorganisms, everything has a connection, and they're working towards a similar goal of sustainability and abundance. So let's have a look at what happens to the nutrients. Nutrients here in the leaf litter. So this is a leaf from last autumn, and it's fallen off the tree, come down to the ground, and it's starting to decompose. And there's lots of agents involved in that, from earthworms and large insects down to smaller insects like really tiny insects, and then obviously into
microorganisms that we can't really see much of, bacteria, and in particular fungus. And what's happening is that that's getting broken down, and as we go through, I can take off the top leaves, and underneath I'll see leaves that are sort of in bits and broken up, and they're maybe from the year before. And if I go down even further, then I get to a much darker layer of organic matter. So the leaves have gone into bits and then into organic matter that we call humus. And then that's gone into the soil. So if I dig down a little bit further, and it's just soil with black bits and all sorts of other stuff in there. And then what happens is that the nutrients that are in the soil get taken up by the roots, and the microorganisms help in that process, and they get taken up in the roots, and they go up the stem, up into the branches, and then the tree, the leaves of the tree grow with those nutrients, and then they start to photosynthesize, and at the end of the year they drop back down again, and they drop back down onto the soil, onto the ground, and the whole thing starts again. What that is a cycle, and it's a cycle of nutrients, and it is absolutely crucial to enable that system, that natural system, to be sustainable and keep going. And there are cycles of nutrients. In this case, there are cycles of carbon, there are cycles of nitrogen, there are cycles of phosphorus, there are cycles of everything. There are cycles of life and death. So a really key principle in natural systems is the principle of cycling. It's a cyclic system, and nothing is wasted, everything is used in that cycle by many different things.
So another principle that we see in nature is that it operates at many different levels. It takes up a huge amount of space, all the space that's available. If we imagine farming or gardening, then we're only kind of using 6 inches of soil, and then for small plants, for like a wheat field for example, only about 18 inches, 2 feet above the soil. But in nature, it's using a huge amount of space above the ground, going up 40, 50, 60 feet, but it's also using very deep depths, as much as the soil will allow, in fact. And you can see that at lots of different levels there are plants. At the ground level here we've got ivy, and here there's snowdrops and stuff coming up, and then there are small herbs and shrubs, small trees. So a hazel is a small tree here, and then the trees are getting bigger, and we end up with kind of really tall, what we call climax tree species like oak and beech, and so lots of different levels with different species occupying those different levels in what we call different niches. So plants that are on the ground here are adapted to less light, and the ones that are up at the top usually need more light. And then you've also got the climbers going up. So here we've got ivy, and you can see ivy on the trees. They need light, but they're not tall themselves, so they use another species to get up to the light. And so you've got layers in space, but you've also got layers in time. And this is an interesting one, because if we look at the snowdrops and what will then be coming, the wild garlic, they are occupying a niche in time. So in the winter time there's no leaves on the trees, and there's more light on the floor, so that's when those plants get their chance to go through their life cycle. And now they're growing, and then they'll flower, and they'll seed, and they'll die out. By the time the canopy then has grown, the leaves have come out, and there's less light on the floor, they'll have finished their seasonal life cycle. So that's that's like occupying a layer in time, as opposed to occupying layers in space, which these other different plants are doing. So stacking is the principle that we call that, where you've got lots of different layers, and plants and animals making use of those different layers for their own lives. So another principle that we see in ecology is that any element in the system has multiple functions. And by an element, I mean something like this tree is an element, a rock is an element, a pond or a pool can be an element, or a stream, a fox or a bird can be an element, or a fungus. So they're all elements that make up the system. And if we take the advantage of the example of this tree, it's an element, and it has many functions. So what are those functions? Well, it's providing biomass, leaf litter for that fertility cycle we talked about. It's providing habitat for all sorts of insects. It's providing a perch and a nesting site for a bird. Its roots are holding the soil, preventing it from being eroded, and the mulch on the surface is also conserving water. And it's also being a support for ivy and stuff going up. So it's got lots of functions, not just one, but it's got lots of different things that it's doing in the system that it's part of. Principle that we see in natural systems is about managing risk, and it's making sure that you've got backup to carry out important functions, and you've got multiple ways of achieving those functions. And if we take an example of a function of the fertility cycle, so we talked about cycling and how important that is. There are many ways in which nature supports that cycle. So there are many elements that go into that fertility cycle. For example, the leaves from the trees, they drop on the floor and they rot down. So that's an element. Fungi and bacteria that help to break down those leaves, that's another element. The moisture that's conserved by the mulch itself, that's another element. Earthworms, beetles, they're all elements that support the fertility cycle. Foxes and other mammals that not only poo and wee around the place, but they also die and rot down, and birds do the same. So they're all supporting the function of fertility cycling. And if any one of those isn't around or doesn't do that, it doesn't mean that the function doesn't happen. It means that the function is then still being supported by lots of other things. In a human system, an example is a hedgerow. If that hedgerow, and the function of the hedgerow is to be a barrier, if that hedgerow is only made up of one species, and a pest or a disease comes along and attacks that species, then the hedge is gone and it's lost the function. But if it's made up of 10 different species, and a pest takes out one, there are still 9 species in there that are supporting that function of being a barrier. So we look at the function, and then we make sure that there are lots of different things supporting that function, because that's what nature does. So another really important principle that we see happening in ecology is that the whole system maintains and works itself without the use of things from the outside. The only things that come from the outside are sun, and that's free, and rain, and that's also free. And in fact, the forest system has the ability to even create its own rainfall or its own moisture through evapotranspiration and other methods. So So by utilising all the other principles of diversity and beneficial connections, and the cycling, for example, ecology, natural systems are able to completely fulfil their needs and create incredibly abundant places for all sorts of life, for plants and animals, for insects, for fungi, just on what they have there. There's nothing coming in to carry fertility into the system. It's created there. Nothing is happening to irrigate the system. It's all created on its own moisture levels, that it's conserving itself, and in fact moving between systems within the ecology. So everything is running on local resources, and that reduces the work of the system, because as soon as we have to go outside to bring in a resource that we need, that's a cost of transport. And every time we can't satisfy our needs locally, we have to make a cost, and we have to do work in order to bring something in. But nature does it all on what it has. It only harvests sunlight and water. Wind also might bring in fertility and seeds and things, but it's a free input. There's no cost to it. So when we use local resources, then we have low-cost systems. So another principle that we see in natural systems is the one of microclimate. Now, microclimate is something that is peculiar to a certain area. Here, where I'm standing now, it's quite cold. It's winter time, or it's late winter, and that is what we think of as the climate. It's cold, it might snow, it might rain, it might be windy, but there's not so much sun, so that's kind of the climate. But if we look underneath here, what we have here is a microclimate. It's different. It's very different underneath here to how it is just 6 inches further away. Here we've got grass and there's leaves, and it's more exposed, but underneath here there's no grass, there's more moisture, and as you can see there's lots of life. Look at those lovely big earthworms having a great time, because they've been shielded from the sun, they've been shielded from the wind, and the moisture is conserved in there. So that microclimate has been caused by the log that's on top of the soil and protecting the soil from wind, sun, rain, and that's caused the microclimate. So I'm just going to put that down. So in permaculture, we've got 2 options. One is that we can create microclimates with how we design systems, and one is that we can work with existing microclimates, and that's very dependent on observation and observing microclimates, what they are, how were they formed, so we can work with microclimates to create more diversity, more diverse habitats. And more diversity means more variety of species, which gives a bigger opportunity for yield and productivity. Okay, so what we have here, looking at different systems. So behind me is a field, that's a grassland system. In front of me is a woodland, so that's with a canopy and a very dark, shady understory. Lots of trees in that. But what this is the edge. So the edge between the woodland and the grassland is a third system. So you've got woodland, edge, grassland. And the characteristics of this edge are different than either of the other two. What we're going to look at is why it's more productive and why we want lots of edge in design, and why nature is also full of edges. So First thing is light, and as you can see, the canopy of the trees comes all the way down to the ground, which means that there's a lot more leaves and therefore a lot more photosynthesis. Whenever you've got photosynthesis, you've got more productivity. So life and productivity is all about photosynthesis, and the more you've got, the better it is. And here, because you've got the canopy all the way down to the ground, there's more green stuff, there's more photosynthesis, compared with what's inside, where most of the canopy is just at the top. Here it's all the way down, so that's one difference, more photosynthesis. Another difference is that the wind will come and hit this edge, and the wind is carrying all sorts of crud. It's carrying bacteria and fungi spores and dust and little bits of leaf, depending on how strong it is, of course, it'll carry more. And when it hits the edge, the wind speed will drop because it's kind of acting like a windbreak, and therefore what it's holding will drop. So it's like the carrying capacity of the wind, because the wind has dropped, then the carrying capacity drops as well, and so all that crud will settle on the leaves or in the area of the edge. And then when it rains, what's going to happen is that crud will all wash off and onto the ground, so that's an extra source of nutrients for what's on the ground. And the rain itself will also fall heavier, or there'll be more moisture on that edge as well. If you imagine an umbrella, even if it's a bit of a leaky umbrella, water will cascade towards the outside, and so the water will cascade on the edge, so there'll be more water falling on the ground under the edge than inside in the woodland, and also more than outside on the grassland. So that's another difference. So more water, more fertility, more sun and more photosynthesis. Another thing that happens is that birds, for example, will move between the inside and the outside, and they will usually stop at the edge, either on the way in or on the way out. And when birds stop and perch, they usually poop. So that's going to add to the nutrient source. So yeah, more nutrients, more moisture and water, and more biodiversity, more photosynthesis because of the light, means that more productivity. So in this edge area, we have generally more productivity than inside or outside. And this principle applies to many or all sorts of edges. So edges between water and land, between deep water and shallow water, between grassland and woodland, between estuary and land, and all these places are creative, productive areas, and so in design we aim to create as much edge as possible. Lots of productivity, no straight lines, lots of curves, lots of edge. So we've spent this time looking at natural systems and what makes them as they are, and why it's important to firstly observe and then to understand what makes them work. We talked about how they colonise bare land. Nature hates bare land and will colonise and create abundant systems with succession. We've talked about diversity. We talked about the relationships, the functional diversity or the beneficial relationships. We've talked about the cycles, that everything is cycled, nothing is wasted, everything is useful. We've talked about how nature is stacked, lots of things in a small space, both in time and in space. We've talked about how everything is multifunction, but also how that any function is supported by multiple elements and parts of the system. And we've talked about how everything is biological and living and local. It's just the sun and some wind and rain that's coming from the outside, they're free. Everything else is managed on local and biological resources. That there is a huge diversity of climate and microclimate, and that works to increase diversity and productivity. And finally, that there's edge, and edges are even more productive areas of natural systems, So all this is learning on how we can adapt and apply those principles to human systems. And if we lose all our schools or our universities as places of learning, we actually can rebuild and relearn. But if we lose natural systems from the planet, then we're in real trouble. So we need to understand them in order to also work with them.
And that's why permaculture draws so much of its principles about design from natural systems, and also from indigenous knowledge, but it also takes modern scientific and technical knowledge as well. And the point being that the more we apply those principles of ecology, those principles that allow nature to be sustainable, the more we can be sustainable ourselves. So the more we apply diversity and cycling in our work, in our design work, whether it's on the land or with our livelihoods or with our communities or families, then the more sustainable we can be. And that's where we want to get to, because we want to be in a society and on a planet that is abundant, that is productive, and that provides everything for everybody's needs forever.